Welcome back for the third part of our lecture cardiac arrhythmia, where we'll going on discussing the clinical features or clinical different clinical types of cardiac arrhythmias. It includes the supraventricular arrhythmia as well as the ventricular arrhythmias, both the tachyarrhythmias and the bradyarrhythmias. So let us start with the sinus arrhythmia, which is basically a benign condition, a normal condition. It varies where the heart rate is saying varying with breathing. Here you see there's a difference between the QRS complex at some spot, otherwise almost it remains same. And as it's a benign condition, you may leave your patients without giving any kind of treatment. Now it starts with the supraventricular tachyarrhythmias, which actually originate from or are dependent on conduction through the atrium or atrioventricular node to the ventricles. Most of them produce narrow QRS complex tachycardia. QRS duration is less than 120 millisecond. The characteristic of ventricular activation over the Purkinje system is usually observed from ECG. Now the conduction block in the left or right bundle branch or activation of the ventricles from an accessory pathway produces a wide QRS complex during supraventricular tachycardia. And that must be of supraventricular tachyarrhythmia, which can be divided into physiological sinus tachycardia and pathological tachycardia. So as you all know, in case of physiological sinus tachycardia, you may overlook the thing, or sometimes you may give beta blockers. It is all depending on the situation. But pathological tachycardia should be classified into different types. So as there is a subclassification of pathological supraventricular tachycardia, we know there is a type called inappropriate sinus tachycardia. There may be a type called focal atrial tachycardia. There are types like atrial flutter, atrial fibrillation, multifocal atrial tachycardia, and AV nodal reentry tachycardia, which is a part of previously was known as paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia. And there may be tachycardias associated with accessory atrioventricular pathways like orthodromic AV reentry tachycardia and pre-excited tachycardia. So the physiological and the pathological, and the subdivision is basically coming under the pathological type of different tachycardias. The prognosis and treatment vary considerably. It's depending on the mechanism and the underlying heart disease. So on the basis of that, you will select your treatment. Supraventricular tachycardia usually can be of brief duration, a term non-sustained, or can be sustained, so that you may require some kind of intervention. You may require drug administration, maybe cardioversion for the termination of the whole thing. And episodes that occur with sudden onset of termination are referred to as paroxysmal. So paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia refers to a family of tachycardias including AV node reentry, AV reentry using an accessory pathway, and atrial tachycardia. So many things are coming under paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia. So just give a glimpse on the different types of tachycardias as a whole. The sinus tachycardia, if it is physiologic, then physiologic one usually doesn't require a treatment except some anti-anxiety drug or beta blocker, and it is basically precipitated by exertion, stress, concurrent illness. Whereas the pathological ones are, again, as I said before, this AV nodal reentry tachycardia, where you will not see any kind of P wave or inverted P wave. AV reciprocating tachycardia, where P wave is usually visible between QRS complex and T wave complex. Atrial fibrillation, where the irregularly irregular RR intervals, and clinically you will see irregularly irregular pulse. Obviously the rate is pretty high. It's coming around 370, 400 within this range. In atrial flutter, it is basically regularly irregular pulse, and the visible flutter waves are around 300 per minute. It's showing sawtooth appearance or sawtooth pattern. There is a kind of atrial tachycardia which is organized the atrial activity with P wave morphology different from sinus rhythm. And then comes the multifocal atrial tachycardia and accelerated junctional tachycardias. So this is a presentation of ECG in case of sinus tachycardia, and if you just see the differences between the 2R of the QRS complexes between this, you see almost the similar gap is found between the respective QRS complexes. So it's basically following a sinus rhythm, and no such ectopics are being seen. So and if you calculate the heart rate, it is coming around 110 or something like that. So this is basically a sinus tachycardia because the condition in which the heart rate is there between 100 to 150 per minute. Symptoms may occur with rapid heart rates, including weakness, fatigue, dizziness, or palpitations. And it is often temporary. As I said before, it comes from stresses like exercise, strong emotions, fever, conditions like thyrotoxicosis, anemia, heart failure. So in all these conditions, you may have seen these kind of ECG features where you can diagnose it as a case of sinus tachycardia. Obviously, you have to differentiate between the physiological variety and the pathological variety. So this is the picture where you will see at the top there is sinus tachycardia, which is ultimately converted either by giving medications or by giving some kind of other invasive therapy to convert it to normal sinus rhythm. So you can see the difference between QRS complexes. At the top, it was very close to each other, the QRS complexes, but in the lower one, the QRS complexes are wide apart, and it is coming within, the rate is coming within normal limit, and it's coming around almost 1500 divided by around 180, so it is around 70 to 80, 86 per minute. So this is a condition where you can see another type of atrial arrhythmias. As I said, the narrow complex tachycardias can be seen with different types. First type is the regular atrial rate, and the second type is with the irregular atrial and ventricular rate. Whenever you are talking about irregular atrial and ventricular rate, your mind should be concentrated on atrial fibrillation and multifocal atrial tachycardia, whereas when you are talking about regular atrial rate, it is usually 1:1 AV response, AV block, and usually sometimes we can see the junctional tachycardia. So regular atrial rate ones can be of various types. The atrial flutter is coming under 1:1 AV response, whereas atrial flutter, atrial tachycardia is coming under AV block, more re-entry phenomenon is probably happening here, and there may be a VA block. So the regular atrial rate and the irregular atrial and ventricular rates are the basic classification of narrow complex tachycardias. Now this premature supraventricular contractions or premature atrial contractions is a condition in which an atrial pacemaker site above the ventricles sends out an electrical signal very early. Ventricles are usually able to respond to this signal, but the result is an irregular heart rhythm. Premature atrial complexes are common and may occur as a result of stimulants such as coffee, tea, alcohol, cigarettes, or even on medications. always you do not require any form of treatment. Now this is a case of paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia where heart rate is around 150 to 250 per minute, and mostly it is seen as atrioventricular nodal reentry tachycardia. In atrioventricular nodal reentry tachycardia, there are two functionally and anatomically different pathways within the AV node. One is characterized by a short effective refractory period and slow conduction, and the other has a longer effective refractory period and it conducts faster. In sinus rhythm, the atrial impulse that depolarizes the ventricles usually conducts through the faster pathway. The impulse, then basically an atrial premature beat which occurs early when the first pathway is still refractory, and the slow pathway takes over in propagating the atrial impulse to the ventricles. And then usually it travels back through the first pathway which has already recovered its excitability. And thus it's initiating the most common slow first or typical AV nodal reentry phenomenon. And here you will always see that we are not able to focus on the P wave. The P waves are either not visible or it can be seen immediately before or after the QRS complex. It is happening just because of that AV nodal reentry phenomenon. So another wave is probably generated and the P wave is coming after the QRS complex. And it's just because of, as I said, simultaneous atrial and ventricular activation. Usually we used to see that in atrioventricular reciprocating tachycardia, which is another form of paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, is a large circuit comprising the AV node, the His Purkinje fibers and the ventricle, and an abnormal connection from the ventricle back to the atrium. This abnormal connection is also called an accessory pathway or bypass tract. This bypass tract is usually results from the incomplete separation of the atria and the ventricles during fetal development. So the atrial activation occurs after ventricular activation, and the P wave is usually clearly seen between the QRS and T complexes. So that is another form of paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, and here in this ECG is very difficult for you to locate this, but you can see this kind of picture in a better way in the book of Harrison. Usually this kind of paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia requires intervention, and hemodynamically stable, regular, narrow QRS tachycardia usually tackled with the vagal maneuvers. It may associate with carotid sinus massage if the carotid vascular disease is low and the patient has no previous history of stroke. A Valsalva maneuver can be attempted in cooperative individuals. If effective, the patient can be taught to perform the maneuver if required. If vagal maneuvers fail, then you have to think about the treatment by giving some kind of medications, and usually the intravenous adenosine is preferred. And as you all know, the intravenous adenosine should be given very quickly, otherwise it will be destroyed by the enzyme called adenosine deaminase. And if the adenosine is taken up in the endothelial cell of or in the RBCs present in the plasma, so you have to give in a very short interval, very rapidly, so that this adenosine should not be destroyed before coming into the proper picture. That means the termination of the event. And if adenosine is not available or if adenosine is contraindicated, then in that case intravenous verapamil or diltiazem can be prescribed. If you see the things are not tackled with adenosine and verapamil, then you may try some different routes, like if the adenosine is tried via intravenous route, you can do a central line, and via central line you can prescribe this adenosine. Still, if it is not terminated, then you can go for intravenous therapy of class 1-3 group or 1A group of antiarrhythmic drugs which are used in the treatment of ventricular arrhythmias, like IV procainamide, and with that you can use some kind of AV nodal blocking agents. So these blocking agents are either intravenous beta blocker or calcium channel blockers. They are very effective, but these may cause hypotension before and after arrhythmia termination and have a longer duration of action. So these agents can also be given orally if the patient is again cooperative and in a position to take these medications on that particular moment. The differential diagnosis of wide complex tachycardia includes ventricular tachycardia, PSVT with bundlement block, and pre-excited tachycardia, and in general these should be managed as ventricular tachycardia until proven otherwise. If the tachycardia is regular, the patient is stable, a trial of intravenous adenosine is reasonable. But very irregular wide complex tachycardia is most likely pre-excited atrial flutter, or it should be managed with cardioversion, intravenous procainamide, and ibutylide. If the diagnosis is paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia with aberrancy is unequivocal, or may be the case in patients with prior episodes, the treatment for this paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia with vagal maneuvers and adenosine is reasonable. No one can challenge your decision. This is the typical ECG pattern, develops a signature, is called sawtooth pattern, and showing two or more flutter waves between each QRS complex. And it's a condition in which the electrical signals come from the atrium at a fast rate, but even sometimes, in the even rate, so you are getting regularly irregular heartbeat and often causing the ventricles to contract faster and increase the heart rate. When the signals from the atria are coming at a faster rate, then the ventricles can respond to, and the ECG pattern develops this kind of sawtooth pattern, and it's showing two or more flutter waves between each QRX complexes. Usually the treatment is lying on the fact that it is symptomatic acute paroxysm in electrical cardioversion, and patients who have been in atrial flutter for more than 1 to 2 days should be treated in a similar manner to patients with atrial fibrillation, and those are on anticoagulant for 4 weeks prior to cardioversion. Recurrent paroxysm may be prevented by giving class 1C, that means drug like flecainide, or the class 3 agents like amiodarone. The treatment of choice for patients with recurrent atrial flutter is again coming back to radiofrequency catheter ablation. This condition in which the electrical signals come from the atria at a very fast rate and erratic rate. The ventricles contract in an irregular manner because of this erratic signals coming from the atrium. And here we are observing irregular heartbeat, and it is the numbers are more than that of atrial flutter. The ECG usually shows irregular QRS complexes, fine oscillations at the level of baseline, and so-called fibrillation or F waves, and there is no P wave. So as we all know that atrial contraction is associated with the P wave, so the absence of P wave is one of the characteristic feature of atrial fibrillation. The common causes include coronary heart disease, valvular heart disease, hypertension, hyperthyroidism, and so many other things. In some patients, we just cannot locate or pinpoint the cause of lone atrial fibrillation. It can be paroxysmal in nature. It may be persistent atrial fibrillation, which may require something like cardioversion. Maybe there is a long-standing, persistent, or permanent atrial fibrillation, and sometimes the triggers are the ectopic focus. So from there, you are getting those impulses. Sometimes you are seeing the chronic substrate fibrosis is responsible for this, and electrophysiologically sometimes we have been seeing there may be remodeling fibrosis. So this is basically the most common sustained arrhythmia and a major public health problem. And you have to see, I mean, you are going to see these kind of patients who are aged more than 60 in most of the times, or may be associated with some kind of cardiovascular problems. These atrial fibrillation is occasionally associated with acute precipitating factors such as hyperthyroidism, but if you are, I mean, associated with hyperthyroidism or pulmonary embolism or something like acute myocardial infarction, it's a very not a very abnormal phenomenon. It is seen in the clinical practice. It may occur in almost 30% of patients recovering from cardiac surgery. So one must be very, very careful with this because it is associated with inflammatory pericarditis. The clinical pattern of atrial fibrillation suggests the underlying pathophysiology which I discussed just a minute back. And this paroxysmal atrial fibrillation is defined by the episodes that start spontaneously and may stop within 7 days of onset. So this paroxysmal type is often initiated by small re-entry or rapidly firing focus of the atrial muscles that extend into the normally into the pulmonary veins, and these non-paroxysmal ventricular triggers tend to occur in older patients and those with more severe underlying cardiac disease. There may be a type which I discussed is called persistent atrial fibrillation, having a longer duration. That means it is exceeding 7 days. So one form is stop within 7 days, and this form is going more than 7 days. And in many cases, this will continue indefinitely unless you are trying to stop it with cardioversion. Cardioversion can be followed by prolonged periods of sinus rhythm. As for paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, episodes are often initiated by rapidly firing focus within these pulmonary veins, but there are some non-pulmonary vein sites including myocardial sleeves around superior vena cava, coronary sinus. So all these sites may be responsible for giving you the focus of atrial fibrillation. Treatment of atrial fibrillation is primarily guided by patient symptoms and the hemodynamic effect of atrial fibrillation, the duration of atrial fibrillation, the risk of stroke, and the underlying heart disease. So there is no specific guideline for atrial fibrillation as a whole. I mean, there are different types of atrial fibrillation, and for that probably different kind of guidelines are being suggested. So while treating these kind of patients, we are usually thinking about controlling rate, that is called rate control, and acute rate control can be achieved with drugs like calcium channel blockers and beta blockers. Mostly the calcium channel blockers like verapamil and diltiazem are prescribed, not the amlodipine, because amlodipine has primary action on the blood vessels. Digoxin may be added, and obviously the selective beta blockers can be given, but with that the non-selective blockers like propranolol can also be prescribed in this case. Uh, these drugs may be used alone. Normally, the combination is not given. Sometimes digoxin is added as an add-on therapy with these patients when the patient is having additional problem of heart failure. So, atrial fibrillation with congestive heart failure is probably the only indication of digoxin right now. So, basically these drugs, all these drugs are rate controlling drugs. The ventricular rate control is achieved by these drugs, and this blocked at the level of usually AV node. Whereas the cardioversion is achieved electrically by giving DC shock, or medically either by giving intravenous infusion of an antiarrhythmic drug such as a class 1C flecainide or class 3 drugs agents like amiodarone. And as I said before, this amiodarone can be given in any condition. The cardioversion is usually given within 48 hours of onset of atrial fibrillation. It's a common practice in patients who have not been anticoagulated. Normally, the anticoagulant is prescribed because the chance of thromboembolism and stroke is very high in case of atrial fibrillation. So, the drugs, if the patient is not on warfarin or drugs like dabigatran, then you may have to prescribe some kinds of injectable anticoagulant in these cases. And the cardioversion, as I said, is usually giving within 48 hours of onset of atrial fibrillation. If the duration of atrial fibrillation exceeds 48 hours, or if it is unknown, there is greater concern of thromboembolism following cardioversion, and the patients usually are having risk for stroke. So, there are two approaches which will minimize the stroke related to cardioversion. One option is to give anticoagulant continuously for 3 weeks before and minimum of 4 weeks after cardioversion. And second approach is to start anticoagulation and perform a transesophageal echocardiography and to determine if thrombus is present in the left atrial appendage. Now, this transesophageal echocardiogram is often missed by the clinicians, and if thrombus is absent in this case, then the cardioversion can be performed and the anticoagulation continued for a minimum of 4 weeks to allow time for recovery of these atrial mechanical function. In both the cases, cardioversion of atrial fibrillation is associated with a substantial risk of recurrence, and which should may not be symptomatic. So, longer term maintenance of anticoagulation is considered based on the patient's individual risk for stroke. So, many of the patients who are getting warfarin or acetylcholine, those people should undergo investigations like INR, and if it is not possible, then at least the patient has to monitor with prothrombin time. Otherwise, it's very difficult to see whether the effect of anticoagulant is there or not, or whether it's causing any kind of complication to the patient or not. Normally, we used to keep these ratio around. Warfarin is basically an inconvenient agent, and normally this is around greater than 2, requires monitoring, and it should remain in between 2 to 3, 1.5 to 2, 2 to 3. So, this is basically the limit within which we are trying to control this. Nowadays, the better drugs are available, the directly acting agents like dabigatran, which is an oral agent. There are agents like rivaroxaban and apixaban. They have renal excretion and cannot be used with severe renal insufficiency. So, those adjustments may be required in this case, but you can use these drugs. The major options for anticoagulations are the antithrombin inhibitor like, as I said, dabigatran, factor 10A inhibitor like rivaroxaban, apixaban, and the older one, old is gold, that is vitamin K antagonist, warfarin and acetylcholine. So, these are the agents which are commonly used in case of atrial fibrillation. So, anticoagulation therapy is basically a must. whether the second way of thinking about the treatment of this atrial fibrillation is rhythm control. And these atrial fibrillation may be associated with obesity, hypertension, excessive alcohol use, sleep apnea. So aggressive treatment of these risk factors can substantially reduce the episode of atrial fibrillation. Mostly in these cases where we just have to maintain the sinus rhythm, mainly guided by patient symptoms and preferences regarding the risk benefit of therapy. And the decision to administer antiarrhythmic drugs or to perform catheter ablation to attempt maintenance of sinus rhythm, that's called rhythm control strategy, is basically depending on the clinician, and it is basically individualized. So on the basis of that, the clinician will select its mode of treatment. There may be some pharmacological therapy which will be very helpful to maintain sinus rhythm, and it will reduce the episodes of atrial fibrillation. So those drugs are basically therapy is instituted once sinus rhythm has been established or in anticipation of cardioversion. Flecainide, disopyramide, so these are all class 1 sodium channel blocking agents. These are commonly prescribed, and the class 3 agents like sotalol, dofetilide and amiodarone can be administered to patients with coronary artery disease or structural heart disease, and its risk of inducing excessive QT prolongation is there. Chance of torsades de pointes disease always there with this kind of medications. The choice ultimately depends on how well the arrhythmia is tolerated, whether the anticoagulation is required before considering elective cardioversion, and whether spontaneous cardioversion is likely, whether there is any previous history, reversible cause or not. So just to summarize the management protocol, long-term management of atrial fibrillation include two strategies: rate control and rhythm control. Rate control is usually doing with the AV nodal slowing agents plus anticoagulant like warfarin or dabigatran. The rhythm control, where you will select some kind of antiarrhythmic drugs, the class 1, that means the sodium channel blockers, or class 3 like sotalol or amiodarone with DC cardioversion, and with that you have to give anticoagulant like warfarin or dabigatran. The recurrent paroxysms may be prevented by oral medications like the same 1C drug flecainide, and these are employed in patients with no significant heart disease. Or you can give some agents like sotalol or amiodarone in patients with structural heart disease. Rate control is usually achieved by a combination of digoxin with beta blocker in most of the times if it is associated with heart failure, congestive cardiac failure. The anticoagulation should be accompanied by a regular monitoring of INR, and target INR is between 2 to 3. So this is indicated in patients with atrial fibrillation. There may be patients with major risk factors, so accordingly you should monitor your treatment like rheumatic valve disease, mitral valve disease, coronary artery disease with poor left ventricular function, or it may be moderate risk factors like the age, the normal AV function, diabetes mellitus. So these are the things which can be closely monitored. So in summary or take home message, you have to remember these points for the management of atrial fibrillation. So this is the ECG picture of ventricular tachycardia. So whenever we are talking about ventricular tachycardia, we are actually coming into the zone of ventricular tachyarrhythmias. Ventricular tachyarrhythmias can be subclassified into different types. The ventricular tachyarrhythmias are like life-threatening ventricular tachyarrhythmias, that is sustained ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation. there is a problem like torsades de pointes, where you see the prolonged QT interval in the ECG picture, the normal heart with ventricular tachycardia, non-sustained ventricular tachycardia, and there are some ventricular premature beats. So most of the times ventricular ectopics and ventricular premature beats doesn't require any kind of treatment. Whereas this condition, ventricular tachycardia, is a condition in which an electrical signal is sent from ventricles and at a very fast rate, but often the rate is regular. And this ECG is showing a rapid ventricular rhythm with broad, often this is crossing 0.14 second. You just see the complexes, and these are abnormal QRS complexes. So broad abnormal QRS complexes which is more than 0.14 second, and AV dissociation may be visible. It may result in the visible P waves. So this is basically a ECG feature of a case of ventricular tachycardia. So this is the most dangerous one, which is known as ventricular fibrillation, and it's a condition in which many electrical signals are sent from the ventricles at a very fast and erratic rate. So fibrillation, the term is the erratic is coming with that. The atrial fibrillation, the rates are faster and it's very erratic. Similarly, ventricular fibrillations are also erratic, and as a result, the ventricles are unable to fill with blood and pump. So the rhythm is basically life-threatening because there is no pulse and complete loss of consciousness. The ECG shows shapeless, rapid oscillations, and there is no hint of organized complexes. A person in ventricular fibrillation requires prompt defibrillation to restore the normal rhythm and function of the heart. It may cause sudden cardiac death. The basic and advanced cardiac life support is probably needed, and probably this is the sweetest form of death. Survivors of these ventricular tachyarrhythmias are in the absence of an identifiable reversible cause, example like acute myocardial infarction, severe metabolic disturbance, at high risk of sudden death, and implantable cardioverter defibrillators, that is called ICDs. These are the first line therapy in the management of these patients. So it's very difficult because it's happening so quickly. Unless the patient is in ICU, it's very difficult to treat these kind of conditions. This is a picture showing torsades de pointes when the patient is on sotalol. This is basically a type of short duration tachycardia that reverts to sinus rhythm spontaneously. It may be due to congenital in nature, may be due to electrolyte disbalance, that means the hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia, hypocalcemia. Maybe the drugs responsible for this, like sotalol, which is a class 3 antiarrhythmic, or the class 1A like quinidine. Maybe some drugs like tricyclic antidepressants, so they are also responsible for causing these kind of things. It may present with syncopal attacks and occasionally with ventricular fibrillation. So QRS complexes are here shown irregular and rapid. It's twist around the baseline. The name is probably originated from the ballet dance. The toes of the French dancers are pointed towards downwards. So from there probably they have originated the term torsades de pointes. And in between the spells of tachycardia, the ECG shows prolonged QT interval. Treatment usually includes correction of the electrolyte disbalance, stopping of causative drug, atrial or ventricular pacing, magnesium sulfate. So these are the drugs usually prescribed in these conditions. Isoprenaline is given in acute case, and beta blockers are prescribed in congenital times. Mostly the long time management of this acquired long QT syndrome involves avoidance of all drugs known to prolong the QT interval. These is generally treated by beta blockers, and sometimes the patients who remain symptomatic despite conventional therapy, and those with a strong family history of sudden death should get implantable cardioverter device as a form of therapy, which is basically first choice therapy in case of ventricular fibrillation. The acute management usually includes, as I said, the correction of the electrolyte disbalance and magnesium sulfate, which is a life-saving drug here. Magnesium sulfate is also a life-saving drug in case of eclampsia. So in gynecology, you may have read that the magnesium sulfate is given for the treatment of eclampsia. Here also magnesium sulfate is given to treat this condition, which is basically an antagonist of calcium ion. It is given over 10 to 15 minutes for acquired long QT syndrome. Maybe IV isoprenaline is acquired cases and beta blocker also in congenital cases. This is basically premature ventricular contraction. So it's a condition in which you will see an electrical signal originates in the ventricle and causes the ventricles to contract before receiving the electrical signal from the atrium. And you see the ECG, it shows wide, bizarre QRS complex, not coming always, but sometimes it's coming. And early R1T ventricular premature beats may induce ventricular fibrillation. But these are not uncommon and they do not cause symptoms or problems. Previously, it was tried with, treatment was tried with drug like flecainide and beta blockers. So flecainide was not proved to be very successful. But if the patient was symptomatic, you can try out beta blockers. But here, in asymptomatic cases, treatment is not required. This is basically a simplest form of bradycardia, the bradyarrhythmia, that is called sinus bradycardia. And you can calculate the rate just like the previous occasions. So when you have calculated the rate of tachycardia, similarly you can calculate it and you see that it is coming below 60 per minute. So the physiological variant may be due to strong vagal tone or people who are athletic. So on those people you may see it's a normal phenomenon. Rate as low as 50 at rest and 40 during sleep can be observed. Common causes of this sinus bradycardia include the extrinsic causes as well as the intrinsic causes. The extrinsic causes are hypothermia, hypothyroidism, cholestatic jaundice, sometimes a raised intracranial pressure, and drug therapy with beta blockers may be digitalis may be an important cause for this. Intrinsic causes like acute ischemia, infarction of the sinus node, and chronic degenerative changes such as fibrosis of the atrium, sinus node like sixth sinus syndrome may be associated with sinus bradycardia. This picture is showing you the phenomenon called first degree AV block, and this first degree AV block is just manifested by seeing the prolonged PR interval. So if the PR interval is more than 0.20 seconds, we used to call it the first degree AV block, and the seldom of clinical significance and unlikely it's to progress. It may be associated with some kind of complications like acute rheumatic fever, diphtheria, maybe drugs like digoxin may be responsible for this. Sometimes you may have seen a syndrome called sixth sinus syndrome. So in that case, the sinus nodes doesn't send out electrical signals, or they are sending out signals too slowly or too fast. There may be alteration between too fast and too slow rates. So you can see a alternate tachybrady syndrome. This condition may cause symptoms if the rate becomes too slow or too fast for the body to tolerate. Chronic symptomatic sixth sinus syndrome requires permanent pacing and with additional antiarrhythmics like the ablation therapy or to manage any kind of tachycardia element. And thromboembolism is very common in case of tachybrady syndrome, and patient should be anticoagulated unless there is any contraindication. But here in case of first degree AV block, you may not have to think too much about the condition. So in this picture actually you are observing second degree AV block, Mobich type 1, that is called Wenckebach phenomenon, and you just see that gradually increasing PR intervals, which is culminating in an omission. When isolated, it's usually physiological and due to increased vagal tone and abolished by exercise and atropine. Whereas Mobius type 2, which is also being seen in this figure, in this ECG picture, the P wave is sporadic and not conducted. It occurs when a dropped QRS complex is not preceded by progressive PR interval prolongation. And usually that is also a recommendation for pacing. It is usually indicated for Mobius type 2 block. Whereas in patients with Wenckebach's AV block, they are usually monitored. Acute myocardial infarction may produce second degree heart block. In inferior oval myocardial infarction, close monitoring and transcutaneous temporary backup pacing are all that is required. Sometimes you may require atropine to make it reversible. In anterior myocardial infarction, that means if it is affecting your anterior wall, then the second degree heart block is associated with a high risk of progression to complete heart block. And temporary pacing here is most of the times followed by permanent pacemaker implantation. And that is the difference between the heart block, which is preceded by inferior myocardial infarction and anterior wall myocardial infarction. So for this, the treatment protocol are going to be different. This is a case of third degree AV block and commonly seen in elderly age groups due to idiopathic bundle branch fibrosis, and some other causes include the coronary heart disease, calcification from aortic valve, sometimes congenital or disease like sarcoidosis. ECG is showing bradycardia, P wave continue unrelated to regular slow idioventricular rhythm. And for this, its treatment is permanent pacing. It's an absolute indication for the implantation of pacing. Just to give you a little bit of information about certain other things which may be manifested as a one which is required treatment in the clinical practice, or which may not be that important in the vision of a clinician. The clinician may overlook the condition, but those blocks may be, these are certain blocks which may be, unless it is being associated with something else, can be bypassed or can be overlooked by the clinicians. One such thing is bundle branch block, especially the right bundle branch block can be overlooked by a clinician unless it is being associated with some structural heart disease or some axis deviations. Hemi block basically is one variety of bundle branch block. It delay or block divisions of left bundle branch and produces a swing in the direction of depolarization of the heart. So when the anterior division is blocked, it's called left anterior hemi block, and there is usually a left axis deviation. A delay or block in the posterior inferior division causes right axis deviation. Out of this, left axis deviation is probably the one which the clinician is giving more importance. There is a type of block which is known as bifascicular block, which is a combination of a block of any two of the following: the right bundle branch and the left anterior superior division and the left posterior inferior division. So any two of the following is termed as bifascicular block. Block of the remaining fascicle will result in complete AV block. So with this, I'm concluding the clinical discussion on different types of arrhythmias. And before concluding, I just have to mention that the management of arrhythmias not only required pharmacological therapy, it also requires cardioversion, it requires pacemaker therapy, sometimes a surgical therapy like removal of aneurysm, that is called aneurysmal excision, and the interventional therapy like ablation therapy. So all these together will help us to manage different kinds of cardiac arrhythmia. And before concluding, I just have to show you the basic classification of the antiarrhythmic drugs once more. And I'm concluding my presentation with the slides where, as per Horn-Williams-Singh classification, the drugs, antiarrhythmic drugs in pharmacology can be classified in following types. Type 1 is called the sodium channel blockers. It is subdivided into 3 types, 1A, 1B and 1C. 1A is responsible for moderate phase 0 depression and short conduction. This classification is based on the nature of the kind of sodium channels are being blocked with these drugs. Type 1B, a very common example is lignocaine, which is given as a bolus therapy and it's a life-saving drug. And class 1C, the example is flecainide. Whereas the class 2 drugs are beta blockers, which includes both the rapidly acting agents like esmolol, which is given by intravenous route, and the other drugs like propranolol, which is basically a non-selective beta blocker, but it's a wonderful anti-arrhythmic agents having membrane stabilizing action. Class 3 drugs, which not only include amiodarone, but it also include one beta blocker, which is known as sotalol, and some other drugs like dofetilide, ibutilide, and class 4 agents like calcium channel blockers, verapamil and diltiazem. And beside these, we have already said that there are some other drugs like digoxin, adenosine, magnesium sulfate are also been considered as anti-arrhythmic drugs. So this is the end of the presentation of part 3, and thank you so much for your patient hearing. And we'll come up with the last part, that is the discussion of pharmacology, probably later in this week.